My name is Tim. I am 27 years old. I've been living here in Spokane, Washington since I was 18 because I came here for college. And that's where I met my wife. We met at Moody Bible Institute. It was our junior year. We didn't really know what we wanted to do afterwards, but for the time, we really liked hanging out with each other. And one thing led to another. Now we're married. Spokane was the biggest city that she would agree to live on. It was the smallest city I would agree to live on. So we ended up staying here, but we really love it, man. We ended up really finding a little village where we feel like we belong. God has really blessed us by bringing us here, by letting us stay here, and we're really excited to see what's ahead. Before Christ, my life was I used to use the term little Pharisee to describe my life before Christ, because growing up, my dad was always a pastor. He was always a missionary, and I was always involved at church in some way, be it from stage, be it backstage, be it in the office, be it in the mission field. I was always involved somewhere, and I always knew the answers to the Sunday school stories. So I had all this head knowledge of Old Testament stories, New Testament miracles, and I had all this head knowledge and all these answers, but it hadn't quite connected to a transformed heart yet. So before meeting Christ, I was just this little Pharisee walking around with all this knowledge and all this pride and all this, high horse energy of like I'm better for some reason, I would say it was that way until I met Jesus. I was just, always like the snobby one at school, always the one who had this fake humbleness, fake humility of like, oh yeah, I'm the pious one at school, but it was not real. It was just a surface level act. I like thinking of it as 3 big moments where God met me where I was at. I would say the first moment was back when I was 14 or 15 years old. I was living in Honduras, and I was serving this mission team. There were some students from a church in New York City, who had come to Honduras to do their, international mission / retreat. And I was just the local boy who spoke Spanish so that, the leaders could have some interpreter out there. I remember one of the nights they had a worship / prayer night in, the worship hall, and they let me stay. So that was kind of cool. And I knew the motions, right? Like, you're at a church settings, spiritual setting, you're supposed to, be solemn, you're supposed to be quiet, maybe have a little scrunched face and maybe lift your hands when they sing or stuff like that. So I was going through the motions, and I remember looking around me at these students who were about my age, if not a little younger, because most of them were like from the middle school ministry. And I remember thinking, dude, they look so real. I wonder if I can have that too. And I didn't do anything differently that day, so I can't take any credit for it. I think God just met me in that moment. I couldn't have faked it. Like, I just suddenly had this overwhelming sense of peace, and I just had a very, very deep and real understanding of the gospel story that I had been told so many times. Suddenly, it just made so much sense. And it just didn't seem like just any story anymore. It was like, oh yeah, God wants to have a relationship with me, and he wanted it so much that he sacrificed his son. His son had to come to human form to live, to die, to be resurrected and ascend. And that was all so that I could have a relationship with God. And I remember just like, I just couldn't control my eyeballs, tears started flowing out of my eyeballs, and it was crazy, man. Like, at the moment, I didn't understand what was going on. Months later, even years later, each time I retrospectively look back at that moment, I have this little understanding of like, dude, there's no other explanation. God just met me where I was at. He knew that this little Pharisee would not understand the gospel unless he kind of like made it abundantly clear. So he made it abundantly clear, and that's the first instance I met God. See, even after I met God and the gospel story became real, for a period of time, I didn't really like associating myself with Christians, with the word Christian, because the way I perceived the church was just so hurtful. It was this hurtful institution that just, grabs money and uses money, sells the story of Jesus. And I just thought it was just so hurtful. In news media and social media, the way Christians are portrayed was usually not very positive. So even though I knew God was real, and even though I was very happy that he wanted to have a relationship with me, I guess I wasn't very happy to be considered part of his body. The second instance where I met God, I was reading the Bible, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, in verse 19, Apostle Paul starts saying to the Corinthians, hey, even though I'm free from it all, I made myself a servant to it all. To the Jews who are under the law, I became a Jew, so that I might reach those under the law. To those who are outside the law, I became as though I am also outside the law, so that I might reach those outside the law. To the weak, I became a weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all means I might save some. When I read that, it just hit different that day, I suddenly understood that my perception of Christianity and the church, even though it was true, right? Church has done some hurtful things in the name of Jesus. Even though my perception was true, it was not complete. It was not full. The full understanding would have been that God intended to use the church to meet all people where they're at. And even though that was God's intention, because we are human and we're flawed, there have been very many flawed executions of church. And I just had this sense that, holding this resentment against Christianity and church isn't really what God would want me to do anyways. What God would want me to do is he would want me to obey in my own way, in my own life, to be the light, right? So I started living out my Christianity a little differently. It had this sense of freedom now, where instead of being ashamed of being associated with Christians and Christianity and church, I was just unashamed. I was unabashedly myself. I really tried to live my life in such a way that I could be all things for all people, relate with any kind of crew. And at first, that was not very welcome by the church I was attending. It was always like, Tim, you come to church on Sundays and you say you're a Christian, but why are you hanging out with XYZ? And at first I was like, I don't know. At first I didn't really have an answer. And eventually I started answering to them, dude, that's what Jesus was doing too, right? Like when Jesus was on earth, he was hanging out with, the outcast, the minority, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the lepers, everybody who was outcast either spiritually or physically or medically. That's what Jesus was hanging out with. And the religious leaders of the time were criticizing Jesus for hanging out with those people. So eventually I started giving that answer. I was like, dude, you're criticizing me for hanging out with those people? Aren't you doing exactly what the Pharisees were doing to Jesus in the New Testament stories that we're reading? I probably said it with an attitude, but that was my answer. And that was my life for most of the my young adult years. And somewhere in college, it was around the end of sophomore year and around the beginning of junior. Actually, it may have been around the end of junior year and beginning of senior, but somewhere there towards the end of college, I just suddenly had this sense of like, if I die, I go to heaven. Like, why am I here? Like, what am I doing? I don't really want to do this anymore. Life is just this constant cycle of like working really hard, getting some measly amount of money, using it all to pay my bills and debts, and then repeat. So it was just a financial nowhere. Relationally, with people, I invest in them. I make a mistake, I hurt them, I apologize, and this cycle of like feeling like a failure. And at work and my ministries, it was just this effort that I put in, and I don't really know if it's working even. I just do it because I say I'm obeying God, but like, what's the point? So I became really suicidal. I was like, yeah, I know I'm going to heaven. I want to be in heaven. I want to be with God. I don't really want to be here. And while I was there, I met God for the third time. And this time God met me in Philippians chapter 1, verse 23, where, again, Apostle Paul is writing, brothers and sisters, I'm torn. On the one hand, I long to be with the Father, for that is far better. And I was like, yeah, me too. I long to be with the Father. That would be far better. And he continues writing, but on the other hand, I know that it is more beneficial for you that I remain in this body. So I'm certain that I'll stay for the sake of the progress and the joy of your faith, I believe is the words that he had chosen. At that moment, God met me and said, Tim, I know you want to be in heaven, but this is not about you. Just as I have met you where you're at, I need to use you, to reach one person at a time, everybody on earth. So it was this moment where I realized I was just being selfish, It's like Christianity is not just about this relationship I have with God, right? It's not, oh, I'm good, so whatever. Christianity is about God wanting to reach one person at a time, right? The end of Judea, Samaria, the ends of the world. And we're in that phase where, God is wanting to reach the ends of the world. And I just so happen to be invited to be a part of it, right? So now my story is more in that chapter of like, okay, I know heaven is infinitely better. Let's try to reach one more person before I go there, And once God is done with me, he'll call me home. But it's not up to me to decide when that moment might be. The fact that he's still having me here on earth means that there's still stuff that he wants to teach me. There's still stuff that he wants to do through me. There's still people he wants to meet. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to whatever that might be. Now I'm in this place where I'm just like hands open, right? Like, I understand that some people have this one thing, and I think that's really cool for them. And for the longest time, I wanted my one thing too, It's my one thing leading worship on stage. It's my one thing preaching. It's my one thing teaching classes. I don't really know. But I know that God has equipped me with all these experiences, of being in the mission field most of my childhood, speaking languages and interpreting for mission teams, relating to people. I went to a Bible school. So now I'm like, well, maybe I don't have that one thing. Maybe God is calling me to one thing per season rather than one thing for the entirety of my life. So now I'm just like, I just keep my eyes open, my ears open to see where God might be nudging me. And 7 months ago, God nudged me into this position at Valley Real Life. I'm working as their database administrator. It's so cool to see how this, tech job skill that I had, which I never thought would be useful at some church, even that got used, even that got wanted here. So now I'm just, being faithful with everything I can in this role that he currently has me in. But we'll see. Like, he has this tendency of only showing me one step at a time. So I know that right now I'm supposed to be here, and next he'll take me wherever he wants me to take me next. How would I explain my relationship with Jesus to somebody? Well, I would be honest with them, and I would say, hey, I have never heard God audibly. I haven't seen visions, but there is this inexplicable supernatural sense of confidence and peace and joy. It's this daily, instead of thinking of doing these things, checkbox of like, hey, each day I gotta wake up and read the Bible and pray, and I gotta go to church on Sundays. It's like having this friend, having this healthy relationship, you know? I realize that nowadays saying father is not necessarily a positive thing. So I just say it's like having this positive, healthy relationship of somebody who wants the best for you. And sometimes what is best for me is not what I want. So it just feels like I'm dragging my feet to do these things. But at the end of the day, if I discipline myself and I obey to do these things, I end up happy. Like I end up like more at peace, less stressed. So yeah, and like sometimes God calls people to big things, you know, like, you know, start this whole ministry, and good for them. But most of the times it's more of like a daily, moment by moment, small thing. Like, hey, I know you have anxiety and you have, you know, suicidal thoughts. Will you surrender those to me? I know that you think that you're a failure. I know that you think that life is meaningless. Would you let me speak truth over those lies instead? It's like, I know you think it's dreadful. I know it's tiring. Will you just choose to believe my words over your words? And, you know, moment by moment, doing that puts you more in tune with what would Jesus do. And eventually it becomes easier and easier in the smaller things. And eventually you can start having this sense of like, oh, am I supposed to go talk to that person in the coffee shop? Or like, oh, did I bump into that person in the parking lot because, you know, maybe it was a small interaction I was supposed to have? Did I interact with that worker at Panda Express because, you know, maybe God wanted to shine a little light? And you just start seeing how God starts giving you more and more opportunities to actually reflect Jesus to other people in these small and big ways, in these short and long interactions. And I would say that's what my relationship with Jesus is like. Many of us have heard testimonies that just kind of sound like this list of bad things that the person has done, and then it's like a but God, and then a bit of like what happened afterwards. And those stories are double-edged swords, right? Because like if the person hearing those stories has been better than this list of bad things, then the person listening to the story could be like, oh, if even Tim is saved with all that list of bad stuff, then I can be saved. But if the person listening to the story is worse than me, then having listed these things actually has the negative effect, because the person listening will be like, oh, Tim got saved because his list of bad things is, you know, shorter than mine. What I would say is like, it's not about the list of bad things that I did and then God met me and therefore he can meet you too. Because from God's perspective, it's like one sin is not worse than the other. One list of bad things is not worse than the other list of bad things. It's all about whether or not you are in relationship with him. And regardless of how far you feel you may have gone, you're never too far, you know? So I would say there's this, you know, unexplainable emptiness or dull pain, or this sense of like not being loved. I would say just give it a try, man. Like, what do you got to lose? God loves you. So, I don't know. Just reach out to a friend who you probably know a Jesus freak in your life. Reach out to them and say, hey, I'm interested in Jesus. See what happens.